Done.
1 second. What if I just close out of Teams? Does that work too?
Yeah.
I'm going to do that just to be sure. Apologies. Back on here. Okay.
Greetings from Biosupply Management Alliance, fondly called BSMA, the global community of supply chain professionals in life sciences. I am Devendra Mishra, the Executive Director and co-founder of BSMA. Moving our world forward, we have Marken, UPS Healthcare Precision Logistics, delivering an extraordinary, pertinent webinar to all of us. And the subject could not be more timely in light of everything around us. Leading this webinar is one of our outstanding leaders of our community of BSMA and the industry at large, a great friend, Dan Bell himself. As many of you know, Dan is a leader of strategy, marketing, and pricing teams at Marken. Over the last, 26 years, he has brought innovation to our industry. He has helped many of us optimize the supply chain, particularly with a focus on transportation and logistics. The industry relies on this licensed US customs broker. The industry relies on his experience in cold chain packaging and temperature logging and good distribution practices. We are really privileged to have Dan lead this webinar. And before I turn it over to him, I just wanted to mention to all those that are online that the Q&A will be held at the end of the presentation. And I know you're here to ask your questions, and I hope there are many, many of them. They'll all be answered at the very end through your use of the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen. The recording will be made available to everyone. And if there are questions that are not answered today, we will do our very best to follow up and respond to each one of you. So, ladies and gentlemen, may I present Dan Bell.
Wow, Devendra, thank you so much. That very kind introduction. I'm very pleased to be hosting for this particular topic, and my accolades sound amazing. Thank you very much for that. But really, the meat of this conversation is going to be with two of our industry experts. It really is my pleasure to introduce our guest speakers. This is Dr. Rowan Iyer, who's the Senior Director of Global Cell and Gene Operations in Advanced Therapies at Marken. He has over 15 years in advanced therapy expertise. He leads our division that looks after that part of our business. It's focused, of course, on how we innovate and customize the solutions to deliver better patient outcomes in this space, and of course specializes in quality and scalability of biomanufacturing. Joining Rowan today, of course, we have Dr. Priya Barniak, I hope I've said that correctly, Priya, who is the Chief Commercial and Development Officer at Pluristyx, over 20 years experience in this field as both a business leader and a scientist in regenerative medicine and cell therapy. She has a proven track record in strategic planning, corporate development, of course, and operational excellence. She's a founding member of 2 biotech startups and has led marketing and sales, process and product development, and secured strategic partnerships. Rowan and Priya, thank you both for agreeing to join us today. We have a really exciting agenda. So I think perhaps we should jump right in. If somebody will advance us to the next slide, it'll take us to where we need to go. So I always like to start webinars with the kind of what's in it for me. What are we going to learn from our 40 minutes to 60 minutes today? And I think probably two, maybe three of the key learnings and takeaways I would like our audience to take away are really going to be around those actionable insights that will help us mitigate for disruptions. And ultimately, everyone's goal on the call, I'm sure, is to ensure that we have patient access to these novel and innovative therapies and medicines. We'll also, I think, if we're asking the right questions, really trying to address those strategies that deal with scalability, especially when trials become approved medicines and approved therapies on a global scale. And then perhaps for a third one, how do we future-proof precision logistics to deliver for these types of medicines and really fully realize the potential of the science through what we can do in the supply chain. So I think, you've got a list of areas that we'll try and cover and talk about. My particular favorite, of course, is how we deal with tariffs and those tensions associated with trade barriers. We'll look at the scaling, of course, and then perhaps if we have some time at the end, spend some time thinking about what the future should look like. And I'll be asking our two guests here to give us their gaze into the crystal ball and tell us how we should think about it. So you've probably heard enough of me introducing these two folks. Perhaps if we go to the next slide and have Rowan give his input here. Thank you, Rowan.
Yeah, I appreciate that introduction, Dan, and also Devendra, really appreciate you introducing us and this topic. It's a really important one considering the current environment that we live in. So I'll just give everybody a little bit of a lay of the land here in terms of where we are with the ATMP landscape. So in 2024, approximately 8 cell and gene therapy products were approved by the FDA. And I know this is a global audience, but I want to focus a little bit on the US just because of the metrics around that. In the pipeline, we have over 4,000 therapies, but currently in terms of the overall approved numbers, it's about 139. And if you look at that pie chart on the left, you'll see that that's quite telling as well, because among them, about half, let's say 49 to 55% are non-genetically modified cell therapies that are approved. Whereas if you look at the ones that are gene modified or gene therapies, there's only 33, and then RNA therapies, there's only 35. Whereas if you look at the pipeline, there's been a shift, or there is a shift in terms of the number of gene therapies is now the larger slice of the pie, so to speak. And I think that definitely speaks to where we're moving with this field. We're starting to see much more targeted, much more customized, and much more tunable therapies. And so I guess the take-home message for me from this is that we're on track for 10 to 20 approvals in 2025. We only had 8 last year. And the focus is overwhelmingly on things like gene modified, such as CAR T, adeno-associated virus, oncology, and rare disease treatments. And that pipeline really reflects a shift toward that gene modified therapy landscape. And why this is important is as we start to build supply chains that are increasingly complex, that allow us to have transformative impact for rare and untreatable diseases, we're going to have ongoing challenges. And those challenges include things like manufacturing timelines, high cost of goods, additional disruption, which is really the topic of this webinar, and then expanding global reach. We need to be able to look across international borders and see them as not, barriers, but opportunities. And then, of course, as we start to expand and scale these therapies, we're going to see a greater dependence on raw materials being brought in or brought out of different regions to be able to deliver those therapies on time and within specification. So that's my key takeaway for this one. And then I guess, Kaylee, if we can advance the slide, please. And I'll hand it over to Priya.
Thanks, Ron. So yeah, there's immense market momentum here in cell and gene therapies and advanced therapies in general. We're moving from treating disease to truly curing disease and moving the global population in the right direction in terms of healthcare and standard of care in medicine. But with that comes increasing complexity for these highly precise medicines and their delivery and deployment. So, the promise of precision medicine goes beyond even just the medical implications for the patients and their families to actual economic impact on a global scale, right? So biotech is a sector that is growing globally at a strong CAGR. It's creating a lot of jobs and high-paying jobs, which is driving economic growth for countries that are realizing aggressive growth in this sector and leading to national security as well. Manufacturing, many countries agree, is a critical part of infrastructure and national security, and biomanufacturing is the new wave of manufacturing that has implications for national security. And we're seeing new modalities come online, such as induced pluripotent stem cells, really gaining steam in the last several years in clinical trials and applications that go beyond even just therapeutic application to drug discovery, toxicology testing and screening, and then more recently with moves to move away, but more ethically away from animal models and animal testing to novel analytical methods and platforms for testing. We're seeing this space really just continue to grow and the applications continue to grow for various cell and gene modalities. Again, there's so much of a global population that lives with either a disease, a disorder, or a chronic condition. And again, in the last 18 to 24 months, we've seen autoimmune diseases become another area outside of immuno-oncology for which cell and gene therapy is really giving us a lot of promise. And so the number of treatable humans, if you will, on a global scale is just massive. And so again, there's a real urgency in being able to deploy and treat these populations in a meaningful way, which means that our supply chain has to grow and mature with us. And we have to find ways, as you said, Rohan, to treat borders as opportunities and not as barriers to entry or delivery to truly democratize access to these therapies. And we're talking about multi-billion-dollar markets, again, that have huge CAGR rates, upwards of 30% in some of these areas, and even higher in others, maybe exosome-based therapies and others as they continue to evolve and mature. And so this is really going to drive global economies again. And the number of clinical trials continues to expand rapidly with thousands of clinical trials globally, many in Asia Pacific. And so especially for us, those of us who are more North America based, North America centric, again, we have to think very critically about how we serve this global market, the global population. And finally, manufacturing platform innovation is really shrinking the timelines for manufacturing of these therapies as we look at ways of delivering them, manufacturing them, and delivering them faster to patients in need, especially with conditions that are really a matter of days or weeks for the patient that makes a life or death decision for them. And we're seeing that we can bring the cost of goods down as well by employing these innovative manufacturing processes and shrinking those timelines. But again, that adds criticality and complexity to the delivery of these therapies. And so I know we're going to unpack all of this as part of our discussion. So I'll stop there.
Well, thank you very much, both Priya and Rohan. I think you've set the stage for a really interesting conversation. So let's get into it. Let's get right into exploring some of those strategies that we might use to manage the critical complexities and also how we might mitigate against some of the risks that you've already highlighted. I'm going to kick things off, I think, with a question. Let's start with you, Rohan. As we think about advanced therapy and the surge in demand, the timelines are also compressing. And I was thinking about the announcement, it was maybe a week or perhaps it's now 2 weeks ago, from the FDA roundtable announcement on that incredible case of the 10-year-old child, KD Muldoon, who, you're going to correct me now as a scientist, but I remember it, that child had received the first ever customized in vivo CRISPR gene edited therapy specifically for that child's ultra rare disorder. I'd really love to get your perspective on this. Is the industry ready for therapies on demand, right? And if so, what kind of innovative infrastructure and regulatory pathways or federal support are essential to kind of make this bespoke science, if you like, become a scalable disease intervention?
Yeah, I love the question, Dan. And, I think that's the holy grail of advanced therapies is, can we get a therapy that's bespoke, on demand, to a patient as quickly as possible? And I definitely think that that is where the industry is heading But I want to harken back to a time when we all, essentially saw something similar happen maybe a few years ago. We all lived through this, right? It was the global pandemic where, we saw the use of mRNA technology as an example during COVID, which, we didn't know what it was at that time, and now it's a household name, right? Um, and if you think about where we live in a post-COVID world where that is a household name, thinking back 4 years ago, maybe we would have never thought this. We would have thought this is the stuff of science fiction, really. And here we are today talking about it as a household therapy. I think baby cage's case is definitely one to discuss today, especially given that it's so relevant to this conversation because it was fast tracked due to the urgency and the rarity of his condition. So what he has is a CPS1 deficiency, which is a toxic ammonia buildup in the blood due to a liver gene, a gene that has two truncating variants for the CPS1 gene that result in a toxic ammonia buildup in the blood. And so he was not eligible for a liver transplant, unfortunately, given his young age. I think it was at the age of 6 months that he actually received the 2 infusions of the gene therapy that he received. That's a CRISPR edited therapy, as you rightly pointed out, Dan. You got all your facts perfectly right. And so, what's important about that is that it didn't go through the 3-year long or the 10-year long drug development pathway. It went through a 6-month long expedited pathway. And the FDA, as an example, one of many regulatory agencies that has accelerated pathways such as breakthrough designation, RMAT, advanced manufacturing technologies, which is the newest one, and then accelerated approval pathways. It already has these pathways to fast track things. So the question is, why haven't they worked until now? Why aren't they moving the needle to get therapies to patients like baby KJ as quickly as they can? We also have to temper this with some realism, right? There were no randomized clinical trials conducted on this particular CRISPR therapy. And the only precedent for a CRISPR therapy to date is Casgevy, which is made by Vertex Pharmaceuticals, and in collaboration with CRISPR Therapeutics for a 12-year-old patient population, 12 years old and above, for sickle cell. And that costs $2.2 million a dose. So I think we need a lot of introspection as to whether, a therapy like this is really practically realizable from a cost perspective, from a regulatory approval perspective. But it also makes us think, if this is possible, if we can get something to be approved within 6 months, why can't we do this for every therapy, right? And there's a lot of attention on this now from, leaders in high places. If you look at their leaders of Health and Human Services, the FDA, NIH, they're all talking about this case. And it really does make you wonder if maybe now we're at a point where we can achieve this. And we're starting to see examples of this already. So for example, with 2-day CAR T therapy, which I'll touch on later, we're now reducing manufacturing timelines to the point where that is actually indeed essentially a personalized therapy that is being delivered to a patient within a couple of days of manufacturing. And then with in vivo CAR T therapy being the next step from there, I think we definitely have some promise and some hope that this could well be the next frontier. And to make them bespoke in a way that is customized to a particular patient, I think is really, like I said, the holy grail for all of science and ideally for all of therapy, advanced therapies particularly. But yeah, thanks for the question. I appreciate it.
No, it's great. And now I've learned some new things. I'm glad I didn't mess up the science there too badly. Priya, I'd love to get your feedback. I mean, I'm sure you're paying attention to this just like the rest of us, but anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, I mean, Rohan gave a fantastic and very comprehensive response, but I think, I was equally elated by that FDA roundtable to see the candor of the conversation as well as the receptiveness of the regulators who participated in that. There seems to be a receptiveness to changing the clinical trial landscape here potentially, especially for autologous therapies, like in the case of baby KJ, right? Where we can expedite clinical trial timelines by adopting perhaps a 2-phase system, as we see done in China and Germany and some other jurisdictions, where for a single patient, single dose delivery, maybe you can just do this under an IRB and you don't need to go through the full regulatory process so that you can move very quickly and have more of an agile workflow there. What we really need to do then is think about how we bring that to bear on allogeneic therapies that are going to treat more patients on a broader scale and for larger disorders and beyond rare and orphan diseases. But there does seem to be a willingness to talk about this and see how we implement that, which is, I think, fantastic. Of course, in addition to the regulatory pathway, we also need legislature and legislation to support this in terms of reimbursement models, bringing the cost down to truly, again, democratize access to these technologies, make them largely available, and especially in countries that are much more price sensitive as well, right? Where the GDP, the earnings are on a different scale than you might see in the United States and other countries. We have to think again about that price sensitivity and that access issue. So legislation and drug developers working with legislators, not just regulators, and advocating for these policies is equally important. And finally, in terms of manufacturing and supply chain and logistics, again, if we can manufacture these quickly, we've got to be ready to go in terms of deploying them and delivering them to patients. And so we've got to think innovatively there, critically there. The good news is these are mainly logistics and engineering problems and bioprocess problems, which we have some of the smartest minds in the world in this industry, and together we can solve them. The harder pieces are the biological pieces, the physiological pieces. And so if we can solve everything else, I am very optimistic that we can move quickly.
Well, that's almost a perfect tee up, Priya, and thank you. Your perspective is really, really good for our next topic. I was thinking about this as we prepared, and I'm really interested to hear from both of you about those most impactful disruptions that we see for advanced therapies, both from that supply chain perspective and also the manufacturing, right? How do we turn that science into a thing, and how do we get it there? So, maybe Rowan, this is something that I'll let you kick off on, and then we can weigh in on both those areas. So why don't you give us your perspective there? Well, look, we even have a chart that'll help us think about it. Thank you.
The visual definitely helps. Yeah. So, I think you're right. I think one of the biggest issues that we're seeing today, and that's so topical, is the disruptions that occur both in manufacturing as well as kind of in the supply chain, and they're joined at the hip. These are not two separate disciplines. One depends on the other, and there's an interdependence. It's almost a symbiotic relationship in many ways, right? So I'll focus maybe a little bit on the left, and Priya, maybe you can, give us your manufacturing expertise on the right. But what's represented here is really a circular supply chain, which is more a bit related to an autologous therapy model. But equally, all of these same unit operations would apply to an allogeneic therapy model. And if we kind of go around the circle, starting at the top, you have a typical starting material would be, let's say, a blood collection, a skin biopsy, or perhaps, let's say, a master cell bank that's used to manufacture the product. As we go through that supply chain, and if you maybe direct your eyes to the left side there with that list of supply chain disruptions that could occur, I mean, the number is staggering, really, right? We've already heard about the impact of tariffs and trade conflicts that are occurring right now, which is really topical for today's webinar, and the cost implications that can be having on our supply chains as we import and export goods in and out of the country. We'll touch upon that in much more detail later. There's, of course, geopolitical and regional instability, things like limited access to airports due to, missile strikes and things like that we've seen lately, such as the one that happened in Tel Aviv. We've had IT disruptions, such as the CrowdStrike IT update that occurred late last year. And of course, then the strike in Newark, the FAA strike in Newark that continues to plague the air traffic control staff there. These are all real world crises if we think about them, and they have real world impact in terms of the patients that are depending on these services and these service providers to be able to be in operation 24/7. So in addition to geopolitical and real world crises, there's also the resilience factor. People, vehicles, and tools, all of this stuff requires strategic investment, and we need to be able to make sure that these things act and react on a timely basis and without any error. And then having a mission critical mindset. So, understanding that failure is simply not an option for these patients. These are patients that have rare or intractable diseases that depend on this and have gone through 3 or 4 prior lines of therapy prior to receiving these advanced therapies. So we simply cannot fail. And so therefore there's a high expectation and a high burden on the shoulders of supply chain and logisticians to be able to deliver on time and within specification. We've also seen some disruptions lately in the scientific and structural headwinds that we're seeing from cuts to funding. It's an unfortunate consequence of, sometimes political agendas, but at the same time, we're also trying to streamline the way research is done across multiple areas of government. And so we want to make sure that we understand the implications of those disruptions to the supply chain as well. What we thought was easily something we could get from another country is no longer easy to get, nor is the research that backs up that therapy or that commercial product available as easily as it used to be. And then lastly, I would say a bit of a shift in terms of the capital market. So the VC funding has started to move towards less toward the, hey, let's take a chance on this, and more towards that this is a much more safe bet. I'd rather get a return on my investment within 6 months to a year than wait 10 years to see some sort of a return. So there's a little bit of speculation on the part of the capital markets as well. But I'll hand it over to you, Brian. Hopefully get your thoughts.
Yeah, thanks, Rohan. From the manufacturing side, as you mentioned, the circular workflow is more of an autologous workflow where we're taking something out of a patient, putting it back in the patient, but certainly there's a human at either end, even for the allogeneic piece of it, whether it's a donor going into a patient. And so a lot of the same considerations, right? The first one just being getting the patient or the donor in the chair to collect the materials, the starting materials, if they're cellular starting materials. And again, with a lot of the disputes, the wars that are occurring and the disruptions, it makes it hard for people to get where they need to go on a day-to-day basis. So having been very involved in running an apheresis business, more than half the battle is just getting the human in the chair some days. And so, it starts right there at that very human element. And then there are many nodes of risk as we move through the workflow that you touched upon with the supply chain, but also in manufacturing, right? So we've got to collect these tissues. We've got to make sure they're collected appropriately. The patient or the donor is healthy enough to do that then we can do what we need to do with the cells, manipulate them appropriately to deliver them in the format that they need to be delivered to manufacturing, to either activate them, genetically modify them, or isolate certain cell types, expand them, etc. And then we have to make sure that our manufacturing processes can support this, right? And at every stage, there's always the risk of loss of material every time that you're transporting this material from one place to another. You've got to make sure the chain of custody, the chain of identity are maintained properly for a clinical product, and all the documentation is there, and all the different stakeholders are working in synchrony to ensure that that's happening in a timely fashion, so you don't have material that's sitting when it doesn't need to be sitting, and that you're processing it in a timely fashion. And you also have risk of contamination with open manual processes, which is largely what we rely on as an industry today. Finally, process analytics, right? Critical process parameters and process analytical technologies, which we can talk about a little bit more, are also really important for real in-time monitoring and knowing whether your process is working, you're on the path to success or not. And oftentimes we have to wait weeks to find out that a manufacturing process went sideways, and having incurred all the time and cost behind it before we know that we've failed. And so again, how we test the material and release it, the timeliness of that, whether it's fresh material or frozen material. Some of these tests, like sterility testing conventionally, can have very long lead times, weeks. So you might be administering this therapeutic at risk if it's autologous, or you are, waiting to administer it to a patient if it's allogeneic. And sometimes even in the autologous realm, you're waiting a little bit longer than a clinician might prefer to be waiting. And then finally, we can't minimize the importance of proper cryopreservation, cryostorage, given that a lot of these therapeutics are currently frozen and deployed, transported, and delivered to the clinical site in a frozen format. So all of that has to come together seamlessly. And again, it's a lot of unit operations that have to occur almost near flawlessly to get this therapy back into a human being.
Wow. Well, thank you both of you for your insights. It sounds complicated enough, but I kind of want to press a little bit on one of the areas that maybe we didn't cover, or if we did, I want to dig a little deeper. And I'm going to ask you, Priya, when I'm thinking about those high cost of goods when you're developing an advanced therapy, and cost is dollars and cents, but it's also how those are acquired. I'm kind of curious, how you're navigating those kind of key market drivers that impact manufacturing costs. If you have some thoughts on that, I'd love to hear those. Just I don't want to gild the lily, but I feel like there's something else there we should know about.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts on this. What we do is very special, but it's also today just cost prohibitive for most people. And so this is something that, we think about very critically as an industry. How do we drive this cost down? And I think, 99.99% of us are in this industry, given its complexity and how difficult it seems at times, because we're truly passionate about bringing these curative therapies to patients and families in need. And so we have to drive this cost down. Some of the key drivers are, again, just the complexity of procuring tissues and starting materials, of manufacturing them, and the manual processes that are required today that are highly labor intensive, right? The specialized raw materials that we have to use are also very, very expensive. Growth factors, cytokines, viral vectors. You look at a bill of materials for any cell therapy or gene therapy manufacturing process, and these are some of the major cost drivers. So how do we manufacture these at scale and in a way that brings those cost of those raw materials down? That's something that we really need to think about. And again, because these are such bespoke and specialized processes that are highly manual, again, we require a very highly skilled labor force on a global scale. And cost of labor is another key driver of the cost for manufacturing today, and something that we have to think about, right? How do we have enough of a global workforce to support these cell therapies as they grow and as they explode in the next 5 to 10 years? But how do we keep that cost of labor down? And then finally, the stringent regulatory requirements for GMP or clinical compliance across the globe also add complexity as well as cost. If we can move away from having to manufacture in ISO 7 and ISO 5 clean rooms to more modular, closed, automated systems, we bring down the cost of labor, we bring down the cost of GMP facilities and infrastructure and manufacturing. So these are all areas that we consider to explore as an industry and think about. So process optimization and automation, as I mentioned, closed systems are really important as we intensify these processes, shrink timelines, and try to manufacture more doses at scale. The raw material strategies, as Rohan mentioned, strategic sourcing is really important. And as we maybe run into issues with tariffs and bringing materials in a timely and cost-effective manner across borders, we have to think some more about diversification of supply chains. Even though I've been in the starting materials business for the last 12 years, I am a firm proponent of do not be in a single supplier situation. You should always have risk mitigation strategies for what if something happens and you can't source your material from your primary supplier. So diversification in your supply chain and perhaps vertical integration in some key elements could also bring down cost for you. But in other cases, strategically partnering makes a lot more sense than building that capacity internally. And then again, advanced analytics, right? I had mentioned integrating process analytical technologies, maybe digital twins as we start to bring AI and ML into the picture so that we don't have to always run these processes, but we have predictive modeling, predictive methods, and using AI and ML to really learn and direct us in a quality by design approach to process development and manufacturing can bring these costs down quite a bit. And then finally, the GMP facility, do we really need it in all cases? And how can we move away from that costly infrastructure and CapEx and OpEx there?
Well, look, I'm really pleased that you mentioned my favorite topic, which are tariffs and reciprocal tariffs. And it's my favorite topic because it seems I get asked about it half a dozen times a day, and I'm always keen to hear somebody else's perspective, even if it's to tell me how it's hurting or impacting our business. I think the uncertainty, as somebody said to me the other day when I asked them if they were concerned, they said, we're concerned overall, but we're going to wait and see what tomorrow brings us, because for sure it will be a new story. So that uncertainty is hard to manage. Rohan, I know you've certainly had those same conversations I've had with some of our clients. Anything you want to add to that? I mean, this is a big topic, but anything you want to add in this area before we go to another area?
Oh, for sure. I mean, it's definitely been brought up to me as well. in terms of, we want to, I'll give you examples, tangible examples, right? I've had customers that want to move an apheresis product into APAC. They're worried that if they, don't have the right permits in place or the right documentation in place, that it's going to take a lot of time to get in there and get out of there as a drug product once it's been manufactured. And also, what are the tariff implications of the raw material specifically going into a region where there might be not only tariffs in one direction, but reciprocal tariffs in the other direction, as Bria alluded to earlier. So there's definitely impact there. Another example that came up recently was we were asked by a customer to build some kits for them. Apheresis kits, things that are required as part of the manufacturing process. The components of those kits are considered not a raw material, but they are tariff, non-tariff exempt, I should say, right? In many cases. So depending on the Incoterms and who's paying, you might end up having a double whammy impact and depending on where you build the kits too. So we build our kits in Hamburg as an example. Once they come back from Hamburg into the US, that's a new package of new stuff, not the original stuff that was making up the kit. So does that have a tariff impact? So we're getting this question a lot, and I think there's a lot of hidden exposure there, right? As an example, the USMCA exempts certain compliant drugs, but not the raw materials inputs, as I mentioned. So the tariffs can be as high as 25% just within Canada, the US, and Mexico. The US-China situation, for example, has tariffs up to 245% on APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, and 125% reciprocal tariff. So this is getting to be real, right? And we really don't need 125 or 245% tariffs on a $2.2 million gene therapy, do we? So what we need to really think about, to Priya's point earlier on, is diversifying the supply chain, not putting all of your eggs in one basket, having multiple options, having local manufacturing capabilities that are closer to the patient where possible. And so, like I said, I think that demands a little certain element of planning and preparation, right? Can we actually look at, okay, do we have a local manufacturer within the region that the patient is going to be treated, apheresed, and have that entity, conduct that process, that unit operation? Can we also have more customs expertise? So people who are fluent in trade laws, just such as yourself, Dan. I know you're, one of the experts in this area. Not to make you blush, but we would welcome your inputs on some of these questions too, right? You don't only have to be asking them; you can be answering them as an SME. And the tariff exemptions as well. Where are there exemptions on clinical products, on commercial products that we can start to leverage the laws and reforms and regulations that have been put in place to protect patients against the rise in costs? And then proximity sourcing. So example, there are many platforms and suppliers that are aligned with patient geographies that we may not be aware of. Do we have to get all of our chemical constituents, cytokines, media, reagents, viral vectors, all of the things that Priya alluded to earlier, from that CMO that's based in, let's say, Utah or Texas, or could it be from the UK where the patients are actually based? So I think there's definitely some strategies that we can use to motivate us to want to continue to persevere in these troubling times. But at the same time, it really requires a lot of planning, forethought, and insight into where those geographies exist and what our capabilities are in those regions, and partnering with the right people that have those capabilities in those regions as well.
Well, thank you very much. It sounds even more terrifying than I thought coming to the conversation. But I'll make a few comments. Perhaps I'll put my my trade hat on for a minute. There's some fundamental building blocks, or at least areas that we have to understand. One, of course, I think you both spoke about the rules of origin. And the rules of origin go, where it's made and where did substantial transformation occur, how it went from this thing to this other thing, and how it's treated. I think valuation, right? We've seen the value, the selling value of the therapy, be incredibly high. At least when I look at it, seems terrifying. So rules of origin and of valuation. I think the other part comes down to exemptions. The first question I ask is, let's think about how your product may be exempted from tariffs through either a special provision or by the type of product it is. And if it isn't, we've been very lucky, or by design over the years, that pharmaceutical products and API at certain phases are exempted from a lot of this. Understanding and knowing how to apply those exemptions is half the battle, because then you bring back that degree of certainty, right? As I'm planning my supply chain, I can expect that. I had a wonderful conversation, and Devendra, you may remember, I think it was a fellow member of our group here that said, you know, it left and it was 0 rated, then it was 200%, then it arrived and we started preparing the money for 100% duty. By the time we had set up the wire transfers back to 0%, I think I'm going to have a heart attack. Please don't ask me this again for another 6 months. So, you know, that's a very real example of trying to get around it, but knowing and understanding how to deal with it. And then, you know, probably at a much higher level, thinking about how, as an industry and an advocate for patients, of course, we all are, how can we lobby to make sure the inclusion criteria into those programs that allow for a more appropriate tariff treatment are enacted. And of course, that's right, your congressman, at the end of this webinar. So I'll get off that soapbox. Okay, excellent topic. Probably could do a couple of days, if not weeks, talking about the trade aspects of it, but I'd like to move on. Again, thank you both for your insights. I think, Rowan, we've talked a lot about all the things we need to consider. We've talked about all of the challenges we might have. Let's you know, get down to it now. And I'm going to ask you, you know, kind of what bold steps have you taken to ensure all those disruptive factors that have such an impact on advanced therapies, you know, while trying to maintain and ensuring product integrity, and that we focus wholly and solely on the outcome for the patient? What, you know, what are the bold steps that you've seen have had those right impacts?
Yeah, fair question, Dan. I mean, you know, we have had to definitely think outside the box for the advanced therapy space, and I'll try to keep my answer brief because I really want to get some questions in from our audience here as well. But you know, really having a specialized team has definitely helped, I think. We have a team of over 100 people on, you know, dedicated to advanced therapy work, and you know, in some cases they come from the life sciences industry, and we've been training them on through boot camps and so on and so forth to give them a sense of what is the patient impact of, you know, not doing this job correctly, essentially, and that has definitely gone a long way. In terms of, you know, not being okay with, you know, sort of just settling for the status quo, I think we've definitely built an expert workforce and an agile infrastructure, which means that we have, you know, filling stations for liquid nitrogen, dry ice stations in key locations and hubs across the world. You know, mediocrity doesn't settle for me personally, so I have to make sure that my team is living up to the expectations of the field, which is there's patient criticality behind every shipment, and there's possibly a life that has, you know, gone through multiple lines of therapy that were unsuccessful. So we have to be there, present, and it's essentially perfect to be able to deliver those therapies to those critically ill patients. The other piece I think is real-time visibility or near real-time visibility. So we've had control towers. That's a 24/7 global control tower that is a live operator that answers a phone within 12 seconds or less. You know, we've received thousands upon thousands of calls, you know, every week from our control tower, from patient caregivers, from clinicians, from nurses, from supply chain individuals who are asking us, where's the therapy now? Is it okay? And we are often proactively giving them the updates ahead of them doing that, but sometimes they want even more. So that real-time visibility, the ability to see that on a map using real-time data technology, loggers, GPS loggers, temperature loggers, has gone a long way. And then I think just having a patient-centric mindset, right? We understand these are personalized therapies in many cases. We've got to make sure that we don't mess up, we don't, you know, have any mistakes that could compromise the chain of identity and chain of custody.
Well, that's great. I love when sponsors and companies developing these innovations share their patient journey with us so that we can understand the indication or disease state that we're trying to work through. You know, it very often comes home very quickly to the folks that are involved in that, you know, the part where it has to get to the right place. The science is awesome. How does it get there? It's a very compelling story and helps us stay focused on the patient. Priya, if you could pick one of the recent innovations in the manufacturing of these advanced therapies, you know, what would that innovation be? What one thing do you think that is really shaping the way that we solution for this, if you like, or the way we address those challenges?
One. Okay.
Sorry.
I'm going to go with these, more automated and closed systems that we're seeing evolve and mature in these factory in a box kind of models, right? Again, it draws from a lot of these things we've already talked about, or brings in a lot of these concepts we've already talked about. You have more consistent. You don't have the operator variability if it's automated. You don't have the risk of contamination. If it's a closed system, you might not need the GMP infrastructure, right? The clean room infrastructure, again, if it's closed system. So it brings down the cost of goods, it brings down the cost of manufacturing, it brings down the cost of labor, and it mitigates risk. But on top of that, as we integrate sensors and AI and machine learning and PATs into this, now we can incorporate real-time, non-destructive monitoring so that we know in real time whether our manufacturing processes are working or not, whether we need to pull the plug, we need to course correct, and we can modularize these, right, to do every unit automation or every unit operation either in one big factory in a box system or to have different modules for different unit operations that could include not only the upstream, but also downstream fill finish cryopreservation. And this also makes this easier to deploy, to Rohan's point, in a decentralized manufacturing, point of care manufacturing kind of model to make this more readily accessible and mitigate some of the delivery risk in transport of these products to and from clinical sites and hospitals. So I think that brings in, I didn't answer your question exactly. I gave you a lot of stuff instead of one answer, but I wrapped it all into one.
That's wonderful. And I've really enjoyed our panel discussion. I want to leave time for questions. We have a little bit more time, but I'm going to ask one last one for both of you, and Rohan, you can take this. And Priya, I'll get your take on it as well. But if there is one thing of all of the scary stuff that we've spoken about for the last 40 minutes that you'd really like the audience to take away from this conversation, what's that one thing? And 30 seconds or less would be great.
Yeah, I think the one thing I would say that we can take away from this is that there's change is the only constant, right? Basically. So, we've seen so much change from a policy perspective, from a technology perspective, from a biomanufacturing perspective. Every time I go to a conference, I see a new bioreactor or a new tool or a new, a piece of equipment, to Priya's point. So I think that we need to be ready to adapt to that change, to the new manufacturing systems that are out there, to the disruptions that are coming our way, and just be able to adapt and persevere amidst that change. Priya, your thoughts?
Yeah, 100%. It feels like we're shaking our magic crazy 8-ball, right? To see what the next hour or the next day is going to bring today. Forget a crystal ball. It really feels more like that crazy magic 8-ball. So we have to stay on our toes. And I think really what that means is, again, being very flexible, nimble, and agile, and being creative. All the way from how we're manufacturing to how we're delivering this to, like you said, can we reclassify HTS codes to get around some of these tariffs and costs that are increasing, to strategic partnerships and collaborations in a very difficult capital market. So creativity, right? We are a creative group and industry, and we have to keep that creativity, I think, alive and work together, supporting each other to drive this industry forward through a really somewhat tenuous time right now.
Well, that's wonderful. Thank you. Who has questions that have come in from the audience? I saw some come up. Oh, somebody put their hand up. Do we have questions? Is that Kaylee? Do you have the questions? I see some that have come in that are written. I can take those ones. No? Okay. It's strange, Devindra, it says Devindra has a question, but I don't think you do. I'm going to take some that I can see that have been put through in text. This is a question. It says, what are the most critical lessons from those recent disruptions that we've lived through? And of course, COVID, I don't think we'll ever stop talking about it, although I'd be happy to forget it for a little while. That advanced therapy need to integrate, right? Those lessons that we learned from doing that, what do we need to bring back in? And if we don't adapt and learn from those lessons, what are the consequences? So what can we learn from that? Either of you, take it, run with it, personal experience.
Well, I think we saw a lot of issues with, I mean, obviously with supply chain during COVID-19 and those disruptions, right? All the way from toilet paper to PPE, and that left everyone scrambling. So I think thinking critically about national stockpiles in this space specifically and what materials we might need in case we have another global pandemic or some sort of unforeseen event that could cause those kinds of supply chain disruptions is very important. But thinking about your own critical supply of raw materials and how you again mitigate risk in your supply chain through diversification is very important. But I also caution against, you know, each of us hoarding materials because that doesn't help the industry either, right? If you are hoarding something that I need and now that's stalling innovation and that's keeping me from accomplishing my goal, are we really moving forward together? So there's a fine balance there. Rohan, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely one of the biggest lessons to learn from the most recent disruption, global disruption we've seen in notable history, I would say. My take on this is a slightly different one. I kind of think back to the time when human embryonic stem cells were outlawed, or new derivation of human embryonic stem cell from embryos was outlawed, and we eventually came up with iPSCs as a consequence of that. It was a happy consequence. It was a serendipitous consequence. So I think of this as less of as a barrier, but more of an opportunity. So when disruption occurs, how do we see that as the glass being half full, right? Well, technology has often been developed in response to major disruptions. If we think back to 9/11, how did that improve our screening and management of air, passenger traffic and safety across the world? Similarly with COVID-19, similarly with the derivation of iPSCs instead of using the use of human embryonic stem cells, these have all brought on positive change in many ways. So I like to think of this as, maybe I'm an optimist, I'm not sure, but I like to think of this as an opportunity to take something away from this and say, well, what can we now do to localize our manufacturing? What new technologies can we derive, just as the CRISPR therapy that baby KJ received, that would make it much more easily to treat this person in 6 months or less, and not depend on these complex supply chains that ultimately cause these disruptions in the first place, or are affected by those disruptions in the first place. So that's my feeling on it.
I love this anti-fragile take that, we have to bend it to the point of stress to help us innovate and come up with those great solutions. Devendra, I see that you would like to ask something, and I'd love to give you the opportunity. Go ahead.
The question that came to my mind was that I heard all of the experts talk about the challenges that the industry has. Obviously, it's a very competitive industry, intellectual property is involved. Are there areas the panel would recommend where we can promote collaboration in the resolution of the problems? Can you advise us of one or two areas where we can reach out to other participants in the industry and say, well, why don't we get together and figure out a solution?
I'll give you my immediate answer, and maybe it's a little try, and that is, I love learning from mistakes, but I mostly love learning from the mistakes of others. So I think when we share our challenges, as you've kind of indicated, Devendra, we do really well. And if you have an open mindset, less on the the secret sauce of what makes our therapy so great, but more on the kind of, how do we get the secret sauce to where it needs to be, or where do we get the magic to happen? I think we do very well. And there's some great forums out there. Perhaps we can share those after the webinar, societies and groups that come together. The one thing that we have to do is read, interpret, question, challenge, ask our colleagues in the industry, because that's the only way that I think we'll truly grow. But I'd love to hear from the panelists. I'm sure they've got a take on this too. Great question.
I think we've seen some pre-competitive models emerge, and again, some consortia come out that give public-private partnerships and industry members ways of accessing innovation and having these conversations without the IP constraints or concerns perhaps. And so more of those pre-competitive models, more of that knowledge sharing. I absolutely agree with you. I think my biggest contributions through my PhD and postdoc were probably what failed rather than what worked to science. And so I think we absolutely have to continue to be candid about our failures and trying to keep others from recreating those so that we can leapfrog those to move forward as an industry. In terms of what areas, everywhere, everything. With collaboration, we can move so much faster and accomplish so much more than we could alone. So I'd say there isn't a single area where we shouldn't focus on collaboration.
Yeah, I completely agree. I mean, I live in Canada, in case people didn't realize that, and we have no choice but to collaborate here. We have lots of public and private partnerships. Um, you know, Back in the day, I was working with CCRM, which is this a nonprofit that was working with Cytiva, that's a for-profit company, and all of them were working in a single team in a single lab doing process development. And I think back to that model and how all of the government grants that seeded that idea were possible because of the environment that we live in here, all of which occurs in the University Health Network, which is all the hospitals literally on the same street on University Avenue. And I think that model literally, I think, is what we need across all of our industries, to Priya's point. We cannot exist in a vacuum. We should not see people in the same discipline as us, whether they're logisticians or biomanufacturing professionals, as our competition, but as our partners, and share knowledge, to Priya's point, absolutely.
Well, there is one last question, and it's been asked in several different ways. But in our last few minutes that we have here, this is for everyone really. If you had that magic wand and you could immediately remove just one major barrier to accelerating and scaling those advanced therapies, what would your magic wand do?
Rohan, you want to go first?
Oh, that's a tough one. I have too many magic wands I'd want to wave there, but I think the biggest issue right now for advanced therapy is that we have a lot of different technology that's being used, and they all work in their own good way. But I think it would be nice to see an aligned approach. As I mentioned earlier, I don't think we should see people in this discipline as competition, but can we use the Cytiva bioreactor with the Thermo Fisher, the isolation unit or whatever the case may be, and make the best solution for the patient. And I think the same applies to supply chain, right? If there's someone out there that does it better than us, we should be willing to do that to allow the patient to get their therapy quicker. So just dissolving our sort of quote unquote egos and allowing for the best solution for the patient, I think would go a long way to getting people what they need on time.
I love it. Priya, what's your
I'm
big
going to
wish?
give you another multiple answer rolled into one answer, Dan, which is my MO, which I'm going to boil it down to also piggyback off what Rohan said, to education, right? We need to continue to educate each other and for us to be innovative and for us to iterate and move quickly. We need to continue to educate our regulators on how we can move these quicker and why they're safe or where there might be issues. We need to educate our legislators who are making the laws that either make these accessible or not and affordable or not on these therapies. And we need to educate the public, because what we do is really not voodoo or science fiction, and science is real. I'm not going to get political, but it is real. And we need the public behind us in also supporting and rolling all of this up to success. So I think education and advocacy are a big part of this.
Well, look, thank you, both of you. We are getting close to the end here. I have to say, one of the goals I always have, and one of the reasons I agree to being part of these events, is I want to come away a little bit smarter than when I open up the call. And I feel that between the two of you and some of the questions we've received, I hope that I've achieved that goal for myself, but more importantly, for the folks that took the time today out of busy schedules to come and join us. I want to thank Devendra and, of course, BSMA for creating a forum where we can share these ideas, challenge and ask ourselves those types of questions. And that's probably enough of my chit chat. And I don't know, Devendra, if you'd like to close us up from what I could only describe as a very enlightening session. Thank you.
I would merely say or echo what Thomas Z reported online from Catholics in Europe. He said this is one of the best webinars he has attended. And I would have to echo it for the simple reason that in this nascent industry of ours, how you experts have so clearly, explicitly, granularly focused on issues and given us some ideas, something to think about, given us some solutions is invaluable. And I think our challenge is to, what is the next webinar that we must conduct? Maybe the next webinar is about, hey, what are the failures we've had in advancing the supply chain, building the supply chain for this advanced precision medicine? Maybe that's what the webinar should be. But I want to thank all of you, particularly the Marken team and the experts and all those who have attended for supporting the mission we have, which is basically to learn from each other. And I am looking forward to you, all of you, connecting with us and growing this group so that we can share more and more and get it better at what we do. So thank you for your time and thank you for learnings that we've had. We shall see you soon.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thanks all. Appreciate
care.
your time.
Thank you, Thomas. Thomas Zay is there. He's still hanging in. Thomas is one of the most qualified people in this space of personalized medicine, and he's been doing incredible work in Europe. So, Thomas, thank you for being part of the team.
Well, thank you. I'm learning from organizations like Marken and BSMA and the others. Kudos for the initiative. This was fantastic seminar, the webinar, I should say, and we're looking forward to it. And I really looking forward some organizational efforts, right, to standardize, to exchange this information, to learn from each other, so we can get to the patient faster and more precise. Thank you.
We just published a paper on the current state of affairs with chain of identity and chain of custody that I'll share with you, Priya and Rohan. Thomas already has a copy, and I would welcome your inputs. But Priya, if you would kindly join our cell and gene therapy steering committee, and Rohan, you as well.
Absolutely.
You'll be great assets to our core community is about 40 strong, 40 executives from about 30 plus companies. Having your perspective would be really remarkable.
Thank
So
you.
thank you.
Completely.
Great job.
Yeah, happy to do so.
Thank
Thomas,
you
any
all.
closing thoughts from
Thanks
your
all.
end?
It was just a simple thank you.
All right.
It was a great
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
for
you
the
for attending.
feedback.
Appreciate your
Hold on.
comments.
Bye.
All right, I'll
Bye-bye.
jump off then. Thank you all.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Thank you.